Today's presentation on lessons in accessibility includes adaptations of real employment experiences provided by the Equal Employment Opportunity Commission, or EEOC. These are being shared to illustrate the responsibilities employers have under Title I of the Americans with Disabilities Act, which is referred to as the ADA, to provide reasonable accommodations in a way that helps employers meet these responsibilities, as well as identify best practices they can implement proactively to foster a disability inclusive and accessible workplace. So first, I'd like to introduce myself and the colleagues I am presenting with today. I'm Julie Wood, Accessible Ohio Manager at Opportunities for Ohioans with Disabilities, which we refer to as OOD. I'm also an occupational therapist and a certified ADA coordinator. In my role, I am leading the efforts of the Accessible Ohio Initiative and the Accessible Ohio team, which is aimed at partnering with employers, businesses, communities, venues, and attractions to be accessible and inclusive for all individuals, including individuals with disabilities. I am happy to be presenting today with two of our 4 Accessible Ohio specialists, Tanya and Brianna. Tanya, would you please introduce yourself?
Thank you, Julie. Hello, my name is Tanya Vela, and I am the Accessible Ohio Specialist for the Southeast region of the state. I am also an occupational therapist. Brianna, would you like to introduce yourself?
Thank you, Tanya. Hello, my name is Brianna Potter, and I am also an Accessible Ohio Specialist and an occupational therapist. I serve the Northeast area of the state. Julie, before we begin, would you like to address the accessibility features of today's webinar?
Sure. We plan for accessibility from the start. For example, we use the accessibility checker that is built into Microsoft 365 to review the learner's guide in PowerPoint. We address color contrast, font style and size, and add alternative text, known as alt text, to visual images. Also, in our delivery, we mention each other by name as the conversation goes back and forth to indicate who is speaking. This can be helpful when attendees are receiving this information through services like American Sign Language interpretation and live captioning. After the webinar, we edit the transcript and fix any captioning errors before uploading the webinar to our on-demand library. We also include a reasonable accommodation statement in our invitation to the webinar, so if attendees need an accommodation, they know who to contact to ask. Taking these steps up front can make this presentation more accessible and inclusive for everyone. And with that, let's get started. Tanya?
We know employers with responsibilities under Title I of the ADA are required to provide reasonable accommodations to qualified individuals with disabilities when needed to participate in the hiring process and employment. Employers who wish to create workplace cultures that are inclusive of employees with disabilities understand that fostering these environments can make employees who need accommodations feel comfortable to ask for what they need to access the work environment and perform the job. Also, these efforts can result in employers enjoying the benefits that studies show occur from employing individuals with disabilities. Employing individuals with disabilities can lead to increased innovation and productivity and have positive impacts on the business's bottom line. According to the Employers Assistance and Resource Network on Disability Inclusion, known as EARN, employees with disabilities have skill sets as diverse as employees without disabilities and strengthen the workplace by offering a variety of perspectives for problem solving, innovative thinking, and performing work. Turnover costs are also reduced because employees with disabilities tend to stay on the job longer, and studies showing employing individuals with disabilities can lead to improved productivity, increased morale, and greater diversity in the workplace. So, most employers have a responsibility to provide reasonable accommodations. Today, we want to demonstrate how employers can meet these responsibilities and move beyond the minimum requirements set by Title I. Brianna, this can foster a culture where employees are encouraged and feel comfortable asking for what they need in the workplace.
Exactly, Tanya. Today's webinar will utilize employment scenarios that serve as lessons for the minimum guidelines set by Title I of the ADA. We then will provide best practices for moving beyond these guidelines that can lead to fostering a more disability-inclusive workplace. These employment scenarios are adapted from the EEOC and do not include real names or identifying information. Now, let's start by hearing Frank's hiring experience.
Hi, my name is Frank, and I'm going to tell you about my experience interviewing for a job at a trucking company. I previously worked as a truck driver with 10 years experience. I had to stop working due to health reasons. When I was able to return to work, I started applying to other trucking companies. When I went for my interview, the interviewer asked me why there was a gap in my employment history and questioned me if it was medically related. I didn't know what to do, so I disclosed that I had to take time off due to having high blood pressure that needed to be better controlled. As soon as I said that, the interview was ended and I was not hired.
Well, there are some lessons we can learn from Frank's story. The interviewer asked Frank if his gap in employment was medically related. To help employers, the EEOC has enforcement guidance on pre-employment disability-related questions and medical examinations that describes what is and what is not a disability-related question and addresses when employers can and cannot ask disability-related questions. The EEOC refers to hiring as pre-employment and separates this into the pre-offer and post-offer phases. In the pre-offer phase, which is the time before a formal job offer is made, employers may not ask the applicant disability-related questions. This applies to application forms, verbal or written interviews, and background and reference checks. Tanya, will you share some examples of disability-related questions based on the guidance provided by the Job Accommodation Network, otherwise known as JAN?
Sure. And remember, these are examples of questions employers may not ask before a formal job offer is made. The first example is, do you have any physical or mental impairments that would keep you from performing the job you seek? The second example is, how many days were you out sick at your previous job? Brianna, what are examples of non-disability related questions that could be asked instead?
During the pre-offer phase, employers may ask questions about the applicant's ability to perform a job's essential functions. These are the main tasks the job was created to perform. Here are some examples. Are you able to perform the essential functions of the job with or without a reasonable accommodation? Or can you meet the attendance requirements of the job? In Frank's scenario, the employer could have benefited from knowing the guidance related to asking disability-related questions during the pre-offer phase of the hiring process. Lesson learned. Knowledge about this guidance is beneficial. However, there are some practices that help employers move beyond the minimum requirements and encourage a disability-inclusive approach. Julie, can you start us off with some of those?
Sure, of course. The next lesson to learn from Frank's story is the steps employers can take to help them create a more inclusive hiring process. The first best practice we will be talking about is training hiring professionals on their responsibilities under Title I. Staff involved in the hiring process should know what questions they are permitted and not permitted to ask under the ADA guidelines. OOD has several on-demand webinars in its Inclusive Employer Toolkit that address best practices related to the hiring process, including recruitment and onboarding, as well as the guidance on the pre- and post-offer phases. We've included links to these trainings in the accompanying learner's guide. Tanya, what other disability-inclusive practices can employers implement?
Employers can create hiring protocols for the interview process to help make sure they are adhering to the ADA guidance and creating an accessible and inclusive interview process. During the pre-offer phase, interview questions should be based on the applicant's ability to meet qualification standards and to perform the job. It can be helpful to provide hiring professionals with a list of pre-written questions to ask each candidate. These questions should be focused on their ability to perform the job's essential functions and not focused on disability. Before we move on, let's take a poll of the audience. Please answer yes or no to the following questions. Does your business use artificial intelligence or AI in the hiring process? Okay. Let's see what our questions, kind of responses we're getting. Coming in, it looks like most of you do not use AI during the hiring process, whether intentional or not. This could be removing barriers during the hiring process. Brianna, can you tell us more about this?
Sure. Frank's scenario reminded me of how using artificial intelligence can cause a barrier when addressing gaps in employment. Some employers use AI in their applicant tracking systems to screen out applicants with gaps in employment. According to an article from the EEOC, this can lead to unintentionally screening out qualified applicants with disabilities. This can be a barrier because a gap in employment may be related to a disability. For example, in Frank's scenario, he had to take leave to receive medical treatment to control his high blood pressure. He is otherwise qualified for the position, but if the employer used AI to screen out applicants with gaps in employment, he could have been unintentionally overlooked for the position. To avoid this, employers may choose to turn off or override these automatic decisions. It is a best practice to ensure the AI decision-making tool is being used to measure qualifications and abilities that are necessary and essential to the job to avoid unfair treatment of individuals with disabilities. Employers can also consider how AI is used in other aspects of the hiring process, such as evaluating facial expressions or speech patterns during a virtual interview, or administering tests to provide a job fit score. Having awareness of potential barriers created by AI, turning off certain features, and including a reasonable accommodation statement are all ways to create a more inclusive hiring process. Well, I think that wraps up Frank's story. Let's hear from Vanessa about her experience applying for a job.
Hello, my name is Vanessa. I was born deaf and have been successful in my education using a sign language interpreter. I applied for a job at a technology company. I was excited about being invited to an interview. I met all the job requirements and could participate in the interview with a reasonable accommodation. I contacted the hiring personnel and informed them of my request to have an interpreter present during the interview. The next day, I had a message that the company had denied my request and retracted their interview offer. They didn't even give me a chance.
All right, let's go through the lessons we can learn from Vanessa's story to assist employers with taking positive steps with accessibility in the workplace. Our first lesson is a reminder that employers who are covered under Title I of the ADA are required to provide reasonable accommodation to qualified individuals with disabilities when being considered for a position, unless doing so presents an undue hardship. The employer could have referred to the ADA guidance on providing reasonable accommodation and initiated the interactive process to collaborate with Vanessa and provide an interpreter for the interview if that was the effective solution. So Julie, the next few lessons address ways employers can be prepared to receive requests for accommodations in an inclusive way. So let's start with an idea we've already shared, training hiring professionals.
Sure. Training hiring professionals on the interview process absolutely is a best practice. In the previous scenario, we focused on training related to what can and cannot be asked during the pre-employment phase. It can also be helpful to train hiring professionals on the requirements under Title I of the ADA, how to manage accommodation requests, confidentiality, disability disclosure, and disability etiquette and awareness. Because a request for reasonable accommodation can be made at any point in the hiring process, it can also be helpful to provide education on the types of reasonable accommodations that may be used during the hiring process, so hiring professionals are better prepared when they receive a request. Accommodations can include allowing a job coach to be present, permitting the use of a service animal, and considering Vanessa's story, providing a sign language interpreter. This kind of training can help to foster an inclusive hiring process. Brianna, what other practices can help?
Reasonable accommodation statements inform individuals of their right to request an accommodation and the steps on how to do so. This statement can also send a message to applicants that the employer cares about what applicants with disabilities need to participate in the hiring process. It's helpful to include this statement in key areas, like on the application page, in the job descriptions, and in invitations to interviews. It's also important to post this statement in reasonable accommodation policies, employee handbooks, job postings, and invitations to meetings and trainings. Tanya, how could these lessons have impacted Vanessa's story in a positive way?
Well, training staff who are involved in the hiring process and including a reasonable accommodation statement in the invitation to the interview could have prepared the employer to recognize the accommodation request and start the interactive process to identify an effective solution. We don't know why the employer retracted the interview, but it does lead us to some best practices employers can consider. The first is to plan for ways to remove accessibility barriers and make the hiring process and workplace more inclusive. We have 3 ideas for this, which include creating an accessible environment, making a list of vendors, and establishing a centralized accommodation fund. Brianna, let's discuss these.
Sure. Let's start with creating an accessible environment. This begins with planning for ways to overcome the accessibility barriers in the virtual and in-person interview environments to create equitable access to the hiring process. The tips we have to share apply to a variety of types of disabilities. For example, employers can take steps to make the virtual environment accessible for all by ensuring screen reader accessibility, utilizing live captioning, and permitting time extensions for navigating the interview process. Employers can also provide detailed information about the interview in the invitation. For example, list the accessibility features available, specify whether the interview is virtual or on-site, and identify if the interview is panel style or one-to-one. This can help individuals with disabilities know whether they need an accommodation. Julie, our next best practice to discuss is about vendors. So, creating a list of vendors to contact can help employers quickly facilitate a reasonable accommodation after receiving a request. So let's take another poll. Please answer yes or no. Does your company have a list of vendors to contact for certain accommodations? Let's take a look at our results. They're coming in. Going back and forth, and it looks like most of our attendees do have a list of vendors for accommodations. Great. This is a best practice that can assist in streamlining the accommodation process. Let's learn more, Tanya.
That is great. Having a list of vendors ready to go can prepare employers to act quickly and effectively and efficiently when they receive requests for accommodations, like Vanessa's request for a sign language interpreter. It's helpful to find out about pricing, the time commitments, and whether the vendor provides on-site or virtual interpretation, or both. Virtual interpretation is referred to as video remote interpretation, or VRI. It is helpful to explore both options to be better prepared to identify which is most effective for a request. OOD has a resource employers can use to find interpreters to inform their vendors list. OOD's online searchable database can be used to find regionally based interpretation services. Here's how. First, visit OOD's Deaf Service webpage and locate the External Resources section. It's in the column on the right side. A link to this page is included in the Learner's Guide. To search for the resources, first select the topic you're looking for, such as sign language interpreting. and the county you're looking in, such as Franklin, and then select search. So it's pretty easy. Now that we have shared an example of one resource that would be helpful to create a vendor list for, we would like to ask our attendees for ideas. We would like to know what types of vendors you've created your own list for, or if you haven't created a list yet, what types of vendors have you contacted to fill a request for the accommodation? I invite you to type the lists you've created or the vendors you've created or contacted into the chat, or you can raise your virtual hand to share the information with us. So looking forward to hearing what you guys have already created out there. Brianna, I'm not seeing a whole lot in the chat. What about you?
I am not yet either. Oh, there we go. Some are coming on
There.
now.
It looks like American Sign Language Braille services. Okay, great. Wheelchair accessible transportation, some more sign language. Do we have anything else to share? Okay, they work with Ohio State Student Life Disability Services for assistance in connecting our students. That's from Katie. Some more sign language. Anything else anybody would like to share with us? Spanish interpreters and Goodwill Industries. Thank you, Roger. Okay, well, these ideas are all wonderful and can be used to start your list or to add to the ones that you already have. Julie, I think we have time for one more lesson. Can you take it away for us?
Yes, let's talk about centralized accommodation funds, or CAFs. This is a valuable resource to consider as a way to plan for the cost of providing reasonable accommodations. Sometimes hiring managers and supervisors are concerned with paying for reasonable accommodations out of their departmental budgets. A CAF can ease this concern because it provides a streamlined approach for purchasing reasonable accommodation goods and services from an enterprise-wide fund rather than a departmental budget. Creating a CAF is unique to each employer. To help employers establish a budget, Accessible Ohio can be a resource through our consultative services to provide resources and best practices to support employers in creating a budget that best fits their needs. For employers who are interested, please contact the Business Relations Specialist or Accessible Ohio Specialist in your region. Well, that wraps up the lessons from Vanessa's story. So I think this is a good time to take a break for questions. If you'd like to ask a question, please enter it into the chat or raise your virtual hand. Also, we did receive some pre-submitted questions during the registration process for today's webinar. So Brianna, while we are waiting for questions in the chat, will you share a pre-submitted question?
Sure. Our pre-submitted question first here asks, how much of the budget should be allocated to a centralized accommodation fund?
Thank you, Brianna. That is a great question. Certainly the answer to that is going to be unique for each employer. One idea that we could share that other entities have tried is to kind of look back over the past couple of years, maybe 2 to 5 years, and look at what you have spent on accommodations and take an average of that. That might be an informed way to move forward with a new budget. We also have some resources available that we could talk with employers about through our consultative services that share how other enterprises or employers have approached how they picked what to put in their budget. So that's another option.
Thanks, Julie. Please feel free to put some questions in the chat here. We have another one asking, how do I create a reasonable accommodation statement? And do you have any examples to share?
That's a fantastic question. This is my favorite accessibility tip, is to implement a reasonable accommodation statement because it can be very useful in communicating that you're an inclusive employer and inviting candidates and employees to share with you or ask for what they need to to work and perform their jobs effectively. So a reasonable accommodation statement basically includes communicating the right to reasonable accommodation and then providing contact information so that a person would know the phone number, the person's name, and the email address that they can use to reach out and make their request. We do have some examples to share. We have a webinar called the Reasonable Accommodation Toolkit. And within that, we have a fact sheet and a learner's guide that illustrates those best practices of what to put in the statement, but then also includes an example. So that might be a helpful resource that we could share with you.
Thanks, Julie. That's a lot of helpful information there. I'm not seeing any more questions in the chat, so just a reminder, we will be stopping one more time at the end of this webinar for another question and answer session. So let's continue now with our next scenario. I think we're ready to hear from Angie. She is going to share her experience with requesting an accommodation from her previous employer.
Hello, everyone. I want to tell you about my experience with requesting help at my job at a car washing business. I have epilepsy, which sometimes results in me having seizures. It is very rare that it happens. Usually it's when I'm tired. Anyways, one day while I was hosing down a car at work, I had a seizure. No one, including myself, got hurt. I realized there might be something out there that could help me perform my job despite my seizures. So I asked my supervisor if we could schedule a meeting to discuss requesting an accommodation. He said he would not hold the meeting and instead fired me.
Let's take a deeper look at Angie's story to find some lessons to share. Angie's story is another reminder that employers covered by Title I of the ADA have the responsibility to provide reasonable accommodations to individuals with disabilities unless doing so causes an undue hardship. There are different types of reasonable accommodations that an employer and employee can utilize. They include making the work environment accessible, restructuring a job, permitting a flexible schedule, altering supervisory methods, providing or altering equipment and services, modifying policies, and providing reassignment. Brianna, would you explain the interactive process?
Sure. First, it's helpful to remember a request for an accommodation can be made at any point throughout the hiring process and during employment. The ADA does not require an employee to reference the ADA or use the term reasonable accommodation when making a request. So this means sometimes requests can be subtle. So it's important to recognize the request, quickly take action, and begin the interactive process. This includes verifying a disability exists, which may be apparent, or the employer may decide to obtain documentation when the disability is invisible. Then the employer and individual should discuss the individual's needs to identify what reasonable accommodation would be appropriate. This is meant to be an interactive collaboration between the employer and the employee. During this collaboration, it's helpful to remember reasonable accommodations should be considered on a case-by-case basis because every employee, disability, workplace, and employer is unique. Tanya, let's apply this information to Angie's story.
Great idea, Brianna. Had Angie's employer recognized the request for an accommodation and began the interactive process promptly, they could have collaborated with her to understand the disability-related limitations she was experiencing on the job, such as the employee experiencing a seizure related to being fatigued. After they established how this was impacting the job, both parties could have worked together to identify an effective accommodation. For example, a modified break schedule may have enabled Angie to take a break as needed to manage her fatigue. Brianna, now let's discuss the best practices employers can take to make navigating the reasonable accommodation process more inclusive.
Okay, let's start with the best practice of creating a formal, reasonable accommodation process. The ADA guidance advises employers to engage in an informal process when a request is made. However, it is a best practice to have a formal process in place to document and record the efforts made to provide accommodations. This can ensure when requests are received, the process begins promptly and is facilitated effectively and efficiently. It's helpful to track information about requests, like what was implemented, what it costs, and how effective it was. This can help identify trends to inform employers of possible accessibility barriers that can be removed to benefit all employees and encourage an accessible work environment. Tracking the cost of accommodations may inform how much to allocate in the employer's centralized accommodation fund, which we discussed earlier. The formal process should be conveyed to new employees during onboarding and to all employees on a regular basis. The process should also be highlighted in the organization's reasonable accommodation policy. By communicating to all employees that the employer cares about what they need in the workplace and informing them how to request an accommodation when they need one, sends the message that the organization is a disability inclusive employer. So to tie this back to Angie's experience, having a formal, reasonable accommodation process in place could have prepared the employer to identify the request for reasonable accommodation and start the interactive process. When one lesson is learned, another is waiting. Julie, what's next?
Angie's experience highlights the important role supervisors play in navigating Title I of the ADA. According to a study from Cornell University, employees are 60% more likely to disclose their disability to a supervisor than human resources. So it's important to train supervisors on how to recognize a request for an accommodation and what steps to take next. Training supervisors on their role with Title I can greatly influence an employer's efforts to create a disability-inclusive workplace. For example, one training topic is disability etiquette and awareness. OOD offers a no-cost training designed to help employees and supervisors feel more comfortable and prepared to have respectful interactions with applicants and colleagues with disabilities. Employers can reach out to the business relations specialist in their area to schedule live disability etiquette and awareness training, or can find 2 archived versions of disability etiquette training on our website. A link is included in the learner's guide. Tanya, what's another topic to include in training?
Because some supervisors are involved in hiring, it is helpful to provide education on best practices for the hiring process, like we mentioned earlier for hiring professionals. This includes being familiar with types of reasonable accommodations and knowing the ADA guidelines about what questions can and cannot be asked during the 2 phases of pre-employment. OOD's training for supervisors also addresses the supervisor's role in the interactive process, beginning with how to recognize a request and knowing what steps to take, and how supervisors can assist with identifying, implementing, and monitoring the accommodation. It also discusses how to adhere to confidentiality. Sometimes the supervisor's role is to recognize a request and refer the individual to the appropriate person in human resources, or they may need to assist in ensuring equipment is installed properly and the employee is trained on how to use it effectively. And supervisors may need to assist with monitoring accommodations for effectiveness. This could include ongoing communication with the employee and ensuring routine maintenance is completed. In Angie's scenario, this kind of training could have prepared her supervisor to recognize her request and take the appropriate steps to begin the interactive process so an effective solution could be identified and implemented. Let's see what happens with Carl's situation.
Hey everyone, my name is Carl and I'm going to quickly share my story about an employer who did not let me bring my service dog into work. I was a new hire at a craft store and I quickly realized I would need my service dog's help during customer interaction at the cash register due to my anxiety and post-traumatic stress disorder, also known as PTSD. My service dog is trained to retrieve help if I endure an anxiety attack. And I asked my employer for this accommodation. They denied my request, saying the dog could be a tripping hazard or that other employees may be allergic. The store is an open policy for customers bringing in service animals, so I'm not sure why I was denied. I could not continue working as a result of the denial, and I was forced to quit.
So let's check in with our attendees about Carl's story. Answer true or false to the following question. Can utilizing a service animal be a form of reasonable accommodation? Let's see what answers we're getting in the chat from the attendees. We are tipping in favor of yes, service animals can be a form of accommodation, and the answer is true. So utilizing a service animal can be a form of reasonable accommodation. This customarily involves modifying a no animal policy. So let's talk more about this. Service animals are trained to perform tasks such as calming a person with anxiety, providing navigation for an employee who is blind, and alerting a deaf employee to sounds in the workplace. Through this training, service animals can enable an employee with a disability to perform their job functions. It's important for colleagues to follow proper etiquette when interacting with a service animal. For example, employees should refrain from giving the dog commands, praise, or offering treats. Remember, service animals are trained to perform tasks. Knowing how to interact with them properly helps to ensure they are not distracted from performing the important tasks they are trained to do. It's helpful for employers to know the employee is responsible for the care and control of the service animal, and they should be the ones directing all interactions. Carl's employer may have benefited from education on service animals as a reasonable accommodation, the documentation they can request, and the process for determining undue hardship before taking further actions. Tanya, will you share the guidance for determining when an accommodation may cause an undue hardship and what to do if it does?
Certainly. The ADA requires covered employers to provide reasonable accommodations unless doing so causes an undue hardship. Undue hardship relates to considerations like the cost or difficulty of implementing reasonable accommodation and the employer's unique circumstances. It also relates to whether it would alter the nature or operation of the business. What could be considered an undue hardship for one entity may not be for another. Undue hardship is determined on a case-by-case basis, and the EEOC provides guidance for employers on how to assess the situation. If undue hardship is determined, the employer should resume the interactive process to determine if another accommodation is available that is effective and does not cause an undue hardship. It's best to remember undue hardship cannot be determined based on fears, prejudices, or employee morale. What's most important for employers to remember, including Carl's employer, is whether an accommodation is reasonable or causes an undue hardship needs to be based on applying the criteria from the EEOC for assessing the situation instead of assuming. As we've highlighted, this is always a case-by-case decision. When the result is an undue hardship, the next step is to revisit the interactive process to consider other possible solutions. Let's share the positive steps employers can take regarding service animals in the workplace as a way to foster disability inclusion. One consideration is to create a service animal relief area as an inclusive workplace practice. A service animals relief area is simply a designated space for a service animal to use for their personal needs throughout the workday. Implementing the best practice can create a workplace environment that is welcoming to individuals who use service animals. Inclusive workplaces can implement creative solutions for issues that may arise when service animals are present in the workplace. Providing disability awareness training can highlight tools and ideas to address these concerns with their employees. Employers should be prepared to address common concerns that may arise when welcoming service animals in the workplace, such as employees with allergies. For example, employers consider providing private offices, small air purifiers, and designated one-way paths to travel to accommodate both concerns. Employers who have allergies to dogs and employees who use service animals. This is all for Carl's case. It's time for Carmen to share her experiences.
Hi, my name's Carmen. I'm going to share my employment story with you, all in hopes that you'll learn from it. I worked at the same car dealership for 18 years. I loved my job and the people I worked with. I scheduled some medical leave as recommended by my doctor because I was undergoing heart bypass surgery. Well, 2 days before my leave, my employer approached me to tell me not to come back after my surgery. They felt I could no longer do my job without posing a safety risk. My doctor assured me that I could return to work after the recommended time of leave, but my employer viewed my abilities differently.
Carmen's story brings up some good lessons for us to share. So let's start with what Title I guidelines apply here. In this scenario, an assumption is made about the employee's ability to perform the job after a medical event. The EEOC provides guidance on asking disability-related questions during employment. It states an employer may not ask disability-related questions unless they are job-related and consistent with business necessity in the employment phase. This may occur if the employer has a reasonable belief the employee's performance of the job's essential functions will be impaired by a medical condition, or they will pose a direct threat to health or safety due to a medical condition. Employers sometimes have questions about how to address these situations where an employee may create a risk to safety, especially if a disability is involved. So let's take a look at this through the guidance on Title I offered from the EEOC. Tanya, can you give us more information on what direct threat is?
Sure. The ADA defines direct threat as a significant risk of substantial harm to the health or safety of the individual or others that cannot be eliminated or reduced by reasonable accommodation. Determining direct threat requires an individualized assessment, and the EEOC provides criteria for this in their Technical Assistance Manual for Title I, posted on Jan's website. When the assessment results in direct threat, the next step is to consider whether risks can be eliminated or reduced to an acceptable level through reasonable accommodation. If a reasonable accommodation exists, which can remove or reduce the risk, then the direct threat no longer exists. And as always, determining direct threat should be considered on a case-by-case basis. Julie, what ideas do you have for how the employer can handle this situation in a way that fosters an inclusive workplace?
Well, one idea is to train supervisors and the HR staff responsible for the reasonable accommodation process on the EEOC guidance to formally assess safety risks. This training could be accompanied by a reference tool to use during the assessment to prevent assuming an individual is posing a direct threat. Training provides supervisors and the HR staff with the tools and resources needed to make informed decisions. I'd like to share how this may have positively impacted Carmen's story. Instead of advising Carmen not to return to work after medical leave, the employer could have referenced the EEOC criteria, assessed the situation, and if direct threat was the result, begun the interactive process to explore whether a reasonable accommodation could reduce the risk to an acceptable level. We have time for one more lesson in accessibility that touches on reasonable accommodation and training for new supervisors. Let's hear from Isaac to set the scene.
My name is Isaac. I began my job at a retail store and was successful in learning my new responsibilities with a little help from my job coach. About 2 weeks into the job, a new manager was hired. He did not understand why my job coach was present, and instead of learning about my accommodation, he fired me. I wish I could have kept working there. I was just getting the hang of it.
Okay, let's revisit the foundation information that supports Title I. Let's think back to the responsibility employers have to provide reasonable accommodations to qualified employees with disabilities. Isaac's job coach is an example of an accommodation that can help an employee with a disability perform work tasks when onboarding to a new job. This accommodation seemed to have been approved by the employer, but when a new manager was hired, communication must have been lost. We mentioned before that a best practice is to track the interactive process and the accommodations provided. This can help to demonstrate the good faith effort the employer is making to provide employees with disabilities what they need at work. It documents the success of accommodations and informs new managers or supervisors of existing accommodations to prevent them from being taken away. Tanya, what do you have to share?
Training on the responsibilities under Title I should be provided for new and existing supervisors on a regular basis. It's also important to inform new supervisors of a reasonable accommodation being used by employees. Sometimes a new supervisor is unaware of a reasonable accommodation because a previous supervisor implemented the accommodation without following the employer's interactive process, and thus the accommodation is not documented. Training all supervisors can help ensure employees with disabilities have what they need to perform their jobs. This could apply to Isaac's employer. Maybe a previous supervisor did not document Isaac's use of a job coach, or the new supervisor was not aware of their responsibilities under Title I. Providing education to employees in supervisor or manager positions can encourage decisions are made that align with the guidance from Title I and support best practices for an inclusive workplace. That includes the lessons we had for today. If you'd like to ask a question, please enter it in the chat or raise your virtual hand. We will also be reading the questions that were submitted throughout the duration of the webinar.
Yes, this is Brianna, and we did have another question that was pre-submitted that I'd like to read, and it asks, what do I do if an employee asks to bring their emotional support animal to work?
Thank you, Brianna. This is Julie. So the way to approach that request is the same as you would approach any request for a reasonable accommodation. So you would engage with the individual who's made the request. You would determine if it's appropriate and you're permitted to request documentation if the disability is invisible or not apparent, or if the need for the accommodation is not apparent. So those are the two times that you can request documentation. And then once you've established that the person has a disability and has the right to reasonable accommodation, you begin that interactive dialogue to understand what is the disability-related limitation that is being impacted by a barrier at work, and brainstorm together what possible effective solutions are available. And that would include discussing the request for the emotional support animal. As we mentioned earlier, this sometimes requires the modification of a policy, and that is the form of accommodation to permit the animal to be present in the workplace. And then you just work through some of the best practices that we shared earlier about addressing the animal relief area, that the employee is responsible for the care and the behaviors of the animal, possibly implement some disability etiquette and awareness training for all staff so they know an animal will be present in the workplace and what proper interactions are for that, and then address any concerns that others might have if allergies are present or if an employee has a fear of animals. There are ways to work successfully through all of those situations so that all employees have what they need in the workplace.
Thanks, Julie. While our attendees may be thinking of other questions, there is one that asks, can an employee make a request for an accommodation after more than 10 years of working?
This is another great question. So candidates and employees with disabilities are permitted to request an accommodation at any point during the hiring process or during employment. Oftentimes, individuals with disabilities do not need accommodations to compete for a job or to perform the job. Sometimes a person may enter into a job and not need something until something changes. So maybe that's a change in the disability or a change in the workplace. And that change could cause a person who has not previously needed an accommodation to need one now. So yes, that could happen 10 years after working. Sometimes people acquire disabilities also, either through the aging process, the onset of a condition, or through an injury. So that might be another reason why a person who did not previously need an accommodation might need one now. So yes, the answer to that is yes, an employee can make a request for an accommodation after 10 plus years of working.
Thanks, Julie. That's helpful information. I'm just going to make sure and ask you guys, am I missing any questions or hand raises in the audience?
I don't see any virtual hands that are up. And I do not see any questions coming into the chat.
All right, I guess we will conclude today's webinar. So thank you to everyone for participating and attending this webinar. I want to remind everyone that there is not an exact formula for accessibility. Creating an accessible work environment includes having continuing conversations and education. It also includes being prepared to receive and facilitate reasonable accommodation requests efficiently and effectively. So we hope that these individual stories acted as lessons for employers to learn from. These stories brought up situations where knowledge on responsibilities under Title I could have informed the decision-making process. Best practices were also shared that foster an inclusive workplace by moving beyond the minimum guidelines. Julie?
I would like to thank you all for joining us today and for your continued interest in our webinars. We enjoyed sharing today's information with you. We touched on a lot of best practices and a lot of different topics. So for our employer partners in the audience, remember that our Accessible Ohio team provides direct one-on-one consultation to help address any goals that you have related to accessibility and these best practices that we shared with you today. I would like to thank you, Brianna and Tanya. I've enjoyed presenting with you today, and we certainly want to say thank you to our awesome webinar team behind the scenes who work very hard to make sure these webinars are a success.